Okay, brilliant. So we've got a question here saying, how dependent is the medicinal drug industry on fossil fuels? And that is a really great question, really very exciting area, and definitely a major question that we're trying to answer at the moment. The simple answer is very dependent on it. So a huge number of the feedstock chemicals and the solvents, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, that we use do come from petrochemicals. But there's a lot of really exciting research going on at the moment that is trying to use waste biomass. So the typical biomass in question is called lignin. So these are your woody remains that are left behind after agriculture, typically, and they're not useful for humans at the moment. They're typically burned, and these waste remains, if you perform some really clever chemistry on them, you can get back to some of the same feedstock chemicals which the petrochemicals provide. But it's really a blossoming field. It definitely isn't fully developed, and it's something that will need to be developed as we move deeper into the climate crisis. We try and solve the climate crisis. Very quick question: what subjects did I take for my A levels? So it was essentially biology, chemistry, and maths, and I did further maths alongside that. Let me look at what else we've got in the Q&A. Yeah, interesting question here. Wouldn't the presence of unsaturated carbons make it more likely for drugs to be reacted or to react or be broken down? So yeah, it is interesting. So as you'll have been told, unsaturated carbons can do chemical reactions. If you think back to the molecules that we were talking about earlier, and if anyone wants to Google it, the drug name was apixaban, you'll see that a lot of those unsaturated carbons were in six-membered rings. And some of you who have covered aromatic chemistry know that if we have six carbons that are all unsaturated and all in a ring, then the molecule is actually very stable. So those rings we call aromatic rings, and they tend to not actually be broken down very quickly. But the field of how drugs react and how drugs are broken down is a massive one. And metabolic studies make up a huge part of the work that goes towards developing new drugs. Because often you have the case where a drug might be safe and it might be very effective against the disease, but then when you administer it to the body, it could be metabolized and it could react into something that becomes toxic. So it's a very relevant field. We've got a question here saying, would it be possible to take compounds from nature, then decompose them to form a simpler product and then reverse the steps? To simply answer that, yes. And again, this is quite a major field, and sometimes natural products are actually very prevalent in the living organism. The example I showed earlier of Taxol is an example where they're very scarce in the living organism, but sometimes we can actually farm natural products on a really large scale, or we can produce them via fermentation. So the penicillins are a really good example of this. And then we can use what's called degradation to access more interesting structures. So that is kind of the other side of the coin. What's quite nice about total synthesis is that because we start from very simple molecules, we can kind of add whatever we want into those simple starting materials. So if we wanted to make a natural product analog, something that was very similar to the natural product, but with one slightly different group, maybe a carbon chain coming from somewhere in the molecule, we could just begin with the appropriate starting materials and then go through the sequence. So it depends on what molecule you have, really. So we've got a question here saying, why is it that the chemicals are held in those spherical structures? So yeah, very interesting question. And in that particular case that I showed, voclosporin, a massive factor will be because it is actually arranged in a ring. So if you looked closely at the skeletal formula, you saw that it was a ring of amino acids. So it was actually very closely related to proteins. Some of those amino acids were unnatural, so those are things we make in the lab. And then the reason that it's held in a spherical type shape is because of basically atoms and molecules trying to minimize their energy. So atoms trying to spread themselves as far apart from each other as possible, but keep that tetrahedral or planar arrangement around the carbon, depending on whether it's saturated or unsaturated. And then there are sometimes other factors. So there are sometimes interatomic forces, for example, hydrogen bonding. So there could be a hydrogen bond between like an OH and an amide, and that's what triggers the folding in proteins. How would you choose which plant and compounds to research? Yeah, another really interesting question. And there are lots of different answers to this. So in my case that I presented towards the end, the DPhil B project, the reason that we're drawn towards some of these Himalayan herbs and shrubs is because they have a long history in Chinese traditional medicine. So the Chinese traditional medicine can typically use an extract from the nature that might contain many natural products, and so we don't really know which natural products are having the effect that we desire. So if we can make the individual natural products in the lab, then we can maybe better understand some of these traditional medicines, and also sometimes the structures themselves are unique. So they might have bond connections that we've never made before in synthetic chemistry. And so it's really exciting to try and do that in the lab. I see Saskia's come online. So I think, do we have time for one more question? Or okay, thumbs up. Got a question here saying, does chemical engineering involve some organic chemistry? Definitely. So chemical engineering, I don't have a huge amount of experience in that field, but chemical engineers are ultimately the ones that take our laboratory syntheses of these drugs and they turn them into something that can churn out these hundreds and hundreds of kilograms of your active compound. And that's where you're in the intersection between chemistry, sometimes organic chemistry, physics and physical chemistry. And so definitely like having some understanding of organic chemistry would be really useful if that chemical engineering is in the kind of pharmaceutical or agrochemical sphere. Okay, thanks very much for all of those questions. Yeah, some really interesting ones there.